you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it was actually really interesting to think about just these two projects and these two projects together and the 12 years that went between them, which, of course, seems like nothing. So I titled this The Green and the Greenest because the Sydney Olympics were called the Green Games. That was the moniker. That was the slogan. These are the Green Games. But and they were. At that time, the landscape we built for that project was the largest sustainable landscape built ever in the world. But then, of course, the London Olympics really were the greenest games ever. So it will be interesting to see where the Olympic Games go from here. But in both cases, this was the goal, to do something sustainable, but different, with different goals. So I'll take you through them. It's a deeper dive than I usually do into either of these projects. So for me, this is fun too, and I hope for you, interesting as well. In both cases, we think about this triangulation of site, sustainability, and memorability, because in all our landscapes, we're trying to make a place that evokes emotion, that's powerful, that is memorable, and placemaking and transformative. But for Olympic Games, perhaps that charge is even extra amped up because you want it to be a place that people will recognize and think back on for many generations. So starting with Sydney, the Olympics, of course, weren't in beautiful inner Sydney. They were out in a place called Homebush Bay. And this is a historic photo of Homebush Bay during the time in which it was the world's second largest abattoir, slaughter ground. So Chicago, of course, was the biggest. This one was the second largest. So if you notice the sort of grid of dots, those were really large fig trees. And they were in the center of rectangular paddocks, and that's where these cows were kept, and the trees were there for shade. And so this was our site. So definitely, and after the years as an abattoir, it was industrial in many different ways. So by the time we came on board, it was a very polluted site. So in both cases, both Sydney and London, these lands were incredibly polluted. So when we were called to Sydney, we were called by Chris Johnson, the Government Architects Design Directorate, because this is what was happening. And it's a little bit hard to tell, but, and forgive the graphics, this was in the era of, this was prints, and we taped them together and hung them on the wall. So we were called in because Chris Johnson realized that they had done a kind of a master plan, a very general master plan, and then they had hired developers to do each of the venues. And the developers had hired their architects and their landscape architects, and off they went. And Chris said, I'm afraid that this is going to be, in the Australians' words, a dog's breakfast. And he was right, because we taped these together, and not only were they clearly not relating in terms of geometry, and not only were they clearly not creating a common public realm, but rather individual projects, they didn't even meet topographically. There were 4 and 5 foot grade changes where these met, and no one was resolving those or paying attention to those. So we were hired. We had it turned into 8 weeks, but we had 8 weeks to turn this around, to meet with each of these developers and design teams and create something as a public realm, create a public realm, and to make the public realm as important as each of these venues, perhaps more important than all of the venues. So again, drawings that were done a long time ago, so a little bit fuzzy. We came up with this idea of red moves, green moves, and blue moves. So the red moves were about paving on the site, green moves, of course, about landscape corridors, and blue moves about water. And water really became a central story to the plan. And the creation of a rug, if you will, on which all these venues would sit, a common address for all these venues, a slope from top to bottom, continuous, 800 meters long, a fountain at the top, and a wetland at the bottom. I'll come back to both of those, a train station here, and then the stadium, of course, and the other venues as addresses on this public realm. So here we are in Sydney, but that's not where we were. We were out in Homebush Bay. So this was sort of what the master plan was doing. They had an idea of an Olympic Boulevard, but that's it. It was sort of a street with all these addresses on it. So by inserting this idea of a rug, if you will, or an address for all of this, terminating in water and starting in water, and then these green fingers, these green corridors connecting to a broader landscape. That was so this model was about this big. So this is the way we started. We started with this very small model and sort of basic ideas. The central the focus of this, or a lot of the focus on this, was not only gathering all the energy, the solar energy, which I'll come back to, but really using the stormwater on the site. So the northern water feature, which is here, and you'll see it as it took form more. The northern water feature is where all the stormwater on the site was collected, and it was cleaned through this system of wetlands and the design of the wetlands you see here, and we had to do all of the hydrodynamic modeling to make sure that the water would move through the wetland system at the pace it needed to in order to be polished and cleansed before being reintroduced to the Parramatta River or back to the harbor, back to the bay. So wetlands are about slowness and fastness and slopes and the gradient of those slopes and the right kinds of plants in order to do the filtration job that you need them to do. So here's sort of a summary. We needed a resultant 70 to 90% reduction in average pollutant export from the public domain. We needed to reclaim an industrial site for people and with a high percentage of impermeable surface. We'll talk about that again in a minute. We wanted to integrate the stormwater pollution control into the site drainage system and make it part of the design. We had to reduce the demand for potable water. Sydney is one of those climates like California with droughts, occasional droughts. We needed to to improve the quality of the water entering the natural water systems. And so we came up with a wetland system as an integral part of the larger site system. So water would go into a fountain, be aerated, go to a storage area for irrigation, or go into the wetland system and recycled and used on the site. So you have this is before the games opened, but after construction of this giant Olympic Plaza, the Olympic Boulevard. These, by the way, are shade structures. Of course, that's really critical in Sydney. But they're also solar collectors, and they were also beautiful light features at night, and you'll see that in a minute. But the fountain here was an aeration system, catching the water from the entire catchment area through the wetlands and tiered wetlands, so it moved through each of the ponds at a prescribed rate, and then an outflow back into the Haslam's Creek, which went to the Parramatta River. And then this is a diagram showing how some of that water, while some of it went through the wetland systems, these are each of the tiers of the wetland system, some of it went right from the catchment area to a cistern and helped with the use of water on the site. So the water was used in every possible way. One of the things I didn't mention was that this is the site before, this is the site after. There was an amazing amount of pollutants in the soil, a lot of PCP in the soil. So all that soil was piled here into this giant landform and capped, and that's also how we dug, so it's a balance of cut and fill on the site. So a large earthwork project, a large stormwater reuse system, and solar energy as well, and those sort of components comprised to make this the Green Games, as well as other things, which I'll talk about in a minute, but those were sort of the major foci. So you see here in the background, that's the Aquatic Center, that's the natatorium, and you see it here during the games. They built that a couple of years in advance, and it was building that allowed them to get the games. So, when cities compete for games, They take various approaches to that. Sydney's approach was to build the natatorium in advance. And it became an amazing and major amenity for the surrounding community, which was a lot of immigrant community. And so it really helped them become part of a community. So this Olympic site is part of a community. And this area here, which, let me see if the next slide shows that. No. This area here is also where they have each spring the Easter show. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Easter show, but the Easter show in Sydney is like a giant state fair on steroids. So it's everything from cows to baseball to plants and flowers, and everybody in Sydney goes to the Easter show. So that also gave the Olympic site life after the Olympics. So the natatorium is something that is used by the community. The Easter show happens every year, and they built residential here as well. So the upper fountain at the top of this 800-meter long plaza, this Olympic plaza, is recycled potable water, but seemingly at the top of this long, long incline. And something we all attempted to learn when we were in Sydney was how to surf. So walking through these sort of cannons of water, you felt a little bit like you were in a curl, but safe. There was a public art project, a number of public art projects on the site. This is one of them. Aborigines artists inscribed words and Aborigines poetry in these seat walls. And then remember those fig trees in the abattoir? We moved them. So these are some of those fig trees relocated on the site. Some of them had 160-foot diameter canopies. So they took 2 years to move. So the first thing, of course, they did was trim the trees and then trim the roots and then gradually box the trees in 9-foot square boxes. So they were quite large. And then put them on giant cranes and trucks to move them around the site. And then a lot of fig trees came from upriver, down the river on barges. So big trees were moved around and reused on the site. You can see the walkway through the tunnel of water, and the fact that water is also sheeting across this highly textured surface so that you're getting many water effects, and when the jets are off because of high winds, you still have the water that you're walking over. And you see the Olympic rings. So it was interesting, in Sydney we were working with people at a very high level within the city and the state and the federal government as well. So we were working right with top people, and they were really engaged, and they wanted to make something smashing. They really did. Very different from the UK. Not that they didn't want to make something smashing, but, they're British. So they didn't really want to make a splash. They didn't want to be Beijing. They wanted to be the opposite of Beijing. And we dealt with so much hierarchy in Great Britain as opposed to here when we were talking directly to the minister in charge of the games. So because the games have a lot of people. A lot of people come to the games. It's just a huge number of people. And so you're dealing with a lot of paving. And you'll see a difference in how we dealt with it in Sydney and a very different approach in London. Here, the idea was to, first of all, use colors and patterns that were based on Aborigines colors and patterns and the patterns of the original abattoir, and to use an interlocking paving system with a structural soil beneath it that would allow trucks and cars to drive anywhere, but still keep plants happy. And we mocked that up on the site a year in advance to make sure that it actually did stay permeable after a year's time, and it did. So under the trees, there's trench drains, and that's all permeable paving and continuous structural fill. The boulevard itself, which of course in non-game mode is a street, is a more traditional interlocking paving system. And here's a good view of the solar panels and the shade structures and the light features. So this shows you the system as it was going in of structural fill And these are the fig trees that came by barge down the river and were planted at this size. And these, you can barely see it in this image, but you can see the gaps between these pavers, so that's how air and water would add to the water that was getting to the roots through an irrigation system. And again, you can see those little gaps. That's the stadium. It's amazing, the scale of the stadium, which of course in both cases gets smaller after the games. So they design these stadiums so that post-games they take part of the stadium away and it's smaller. So the Figaro Fountain that I showed you a minute ago is just off the image here. There are the Olympic rings, and here's the Boulevard to the Northern Water feature, which you see lit at night, and you see the stanchions and the light display that they make at night, and then the solar panels collecting solar energy in the day, and you get a sense of the amount of people. The Olympic Village in the distance here. So then you move to the northern end of that 800 meter long plaza and boulevard, and you get to the Northern Water feature, which is the wetland feature, and you see the hill in the distance where all the polluted soils are stacked, piled. So the stadium, the wetland system, and this is just after construction, before the games. So you can still see the plants are still here, a little bit hair plugs. And they got really lush really fast. So one of the things we found that was a happy accident was people would gather at the top of the mound, especially at sunset. So these jets, and we mock these jets up ahead of time on site as well, so these jets are aerating all the stormwater on the site before it enters the wetland system or before it gets recycled into storage for irrigation use on the site. Beautifully lit at night, and another one of the artist projects for the games worked on this pier with us. And the pier is underlit, and it starts out as hot colors, and as you progress out over the wetland, it ends up in cool colors. So this was the artist's way of speaking to the fact that the water is changing as it moves through this system. So stainless steel tubes, and you can see how they're both twisting and torquing, which emphasize sort of the cascading effect. And of course, we hadn't quite anticipated people getting in the fountain, but of course they did. So notice that the water coming out is above eye level. That's really important because people will stick their faces in a jet of water. So it became quite the ceremony at the top of the mound, looking back over the games every evening. Okay, so now we go to London. And it's amazing how that site looks sort of similar, doesn't it? So this is East London. This is near Stratford. This is, if you read The Little Match Girl, this is where those factories were, where The Little Match Girl took place. So incredibly polluted land. And before, again, there was a master plan that was done by others. They were trying to build from that master plan. And the late John Hopkins, who was with the Olympic Delivery Authority, who was a landscape architect, realized that you can't go from a master plan to construction. You need a design in between. So he called us in, and once again, we had a tight deadline. We had to move half our office there. We had to set up a workshop. We had to get all the venue designers in. We had to get all the engineers in because they were already building it. And yet there wasn't a there. You know, there just wasn't a heart to it. There wasn't and I'll show you how we worked through that issue. But the first thing that happened after they selected the site was, in order to make the dirt safe, they had to dig it up anywhere they thought they wanted to move dirt around. They had to dig it up and put it in big trucks and bake it at like 500 degrees. And that made the dirt banal. So that took out the major toxic issues. Okay, so this was the master plan as it existed when we were hired. And the first thing we noticed about it was that the green was like background, sort of leftover, and that there was a lot of gray paving. And having worked on the Sydney Olympics, we knew that you don't need that much paving before or after the games. You may need it for the 300,000 people or however many hundreds of thousands of people would come to the games, but you didn't really need this much paving. And it seemed to us like there were redundant systems of paving, like promenades next to promenades next to promenades. And the poor river was having a hard time making its presence felt. So the first thing we did was say, where are people coming from? Why do we have this paving in these areas? And learned quickly that most of the people are coming from the train station here. This is Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Center. And they're going to the stadium, which is here. And really, not that many people are coming into the northern half of the games, the site. And it really is a southern half and a northern half because it was bisected by infrastructure in the middle. So first thing we said was, wait a minute, you're over-designing. You've got more paving than you need. And we ended up with a scheme more like this, which very simply, I hope, conveys the fact that the park became the foreground. The park became the address for the games. And this is 274 acres of parklands in the heart of this site and a restoration of a river. Like this. So in the northern half, many of the banks, this is the River Lee, and many of the banks were green-ish, but very steep. And you can see how you couldn't see the river. So when you were at the top of those banks, you couldn't really see the river. So in the northern half of the park, the ecological half of the park, we just laid the banks back and sculpted the banks so that you would have access to and view to the river. Then in the southern half, near where the stadium is, the river had actual concrete walls and steel walls. And so there, because the land was more constrained, the approach was to terrace those riverbanks in a more architectural way, but still the same goal to be achieved of getting views and access to the river. So the design principles were to extend the games to legacy. So we were also thinking about, after the games, making more of the river, and then just accentuating the differences between the North Park and the South Park. So again, we started with a clay model in this office and worked, very roughly and very quickly with clay. And in this case, it was a pretty big model. And we just kept working with this model, and you can see the sculpting we were doing of the riverbanks, laying those riverbanks back and sculpting them so that there would be riparian areas, marsh areas, upland areas, promontories, and promenades. And we just kept working with that same model and refining it and using it as a tool to bring all the designers together and all the teams together. And it's a quick way for us to work and change things easily. So just to give you a few markers, here's the stadium, here's Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Center, here's the Velodrome, which I think is actually the best of all the buildings, and the train station here, which would then access to the stadium here. So we took it apart and thought about it as a layered systems. So the water systems for drainage, for bioswales, for wetlands, and for the river. The circulation systems the river walks, the footpaths, the concourse, and the bridges. And the bridges needed to be more than twice as wide for the games than they needed to be long term. So you'll see in a minute, the bridges were designed to also reduce in scale post games. And landforms. And the landforms were again about balancing cut and fill. So we balanced cut and fill on the site, which saved a lot of money, which enabled us to do some of the things we wanted to do by saving that money. So engineers start to listen to you when you're able to talk about the systems that they're doing. And we had 2 engineers. We had an engineer in the northern park, and we had an engineer in the southern park. We had Atkins and Arup. And in Great Britain, in London, they don't think of landscape architects as being able to do, for instance, topography, grading, drainage systems. So we had to sort of prove ourselves and the science of what we were doing, and understanding that relates to cost and construction phasing. So that's how we sort of gained respect around the table, if you will. Then the lawns and the terraces, and then the plantings. And then thinking about it in games mode, and also thinking about it in what they call transformation mode. Because it's just a matter of weeks. It's like 6 weeks of the games and then the Paralympic Games. And then suddenly venues go away, like this venue goes away. And much of the grass turf areas that we put in during the games for viewing for the hundreds of thousands of people who would be there needed to turn into meadows, for instance, because they wanted us to leave behind 24 habitat types. And those habitat types range from stony meadow to riparian to woody to meadows. So there were many, many different kinds of habitats that we needed to leave behind. And post-games, a lot of that would be converted into habitat. And you can see here the bridges. You see the very wide bridges during games, and then the reduction in scale of those bridges post-games. So here's the northern park. And you see it looks very much like that clay model. So this is, many weeks of work later, but still holding true to the clay model. And you see the amount of paving that was needed for the games. But post-games, we really only needed a promenade of about this width. So all of this paving is made of asphalt that after the games was ground up and stirred into the soil to create stony meadow habitat. So it was a temporary paving system that became part of the restoration of the site for habitat. So the real key was the grading and the way the water moved through the grading on the site. And then using that grading and that water to create the biozones, to create the different kinds of habitats, to create the different kinds of planting. So all of it an intertwined system. And you can see here some of the types of biozones, from wooded gullies to frog ponds and loggeries. So we were working with habitat restoration specialists because we were creating habitat for frogs, for snakes, for birds, for swans, for many different kinds of critters on the site, and different kinds of wetlands and different kinds of woodlands to support different kinds of life. And we were thinking at each turn about how these spaces would be used during the games, with all the people, with the big stadium, with the wide bridges, and then post-games, meadows, and more natural landscape introduced. During the games, they set up these giant projectors throughout the site, giant screens throughout the site, so you could watch the games and be in the landscape. And since it was Great Britain, you could buy a bottle of wine and sit by the river and watch the games on a giant screen. That part was really quite lovely. So here we are in the southern park. And in the south park, you see, of course, the stadium and a lot more paving. This has now been turned into a festival park. But you see here the Olympic Gardens and the River Lee and its tributary, which went around the stadiums. So, being the British, they didn't want a big flashy fountain. So think about Sydney and think about that amazing use of water and the statement of how we were using water as a feature, as an iconic feature on the site. The British wanted Olympic Gardens. So these are the Olympic Gardens here on those terrace banks of the river. So we came up with an idea to theme those gardens based on all the countries who come to the games. And really this was a nod to the British legacy of plant collections, of going all over the world and collecting plants and bringing them back to the UK. And it was unbelievable what a success this was, how many people loved the gardens and came and took pictures and studied the gardens and wanted to know the species. And we worked with a doctor of horticulture and botany from one of the universities there to teach the contractors how to plant these gardens, how to plant these seeds. You know, they were local plants, they were native plants. We wanted the wild look, and nobody knew how to do that. So it took people on site working with the contractors to teach them how to do this. But it was great fun to see people come to their garden from their country and check it out during the games. And then there was the structure of these gardens, so they weren't just like throw all the seeds in and throw all the plants in and walk away. We used trees to create form and structure. We had some riparian clusters of trees. We had these arches of hedges that created sort of super graphics. We had slopes that we had to deal with differently. We had lawn areas, and then we had hardscapes for access. So it was a whole series of systems that gave actual, sort of structure to the planting. And again, water informing the various habitats on the site. So that's the whole plan for the games. So now I'll take you through construction. So here's the beginning of construction on the site, and you can see it looks like the clay model. So I love that. I love when the dirt is actually looking like those clay models. And you can see the double bridges. You can see how there's two pieces to the bridge. You can see the Velodrome, the stadium, the aquatics coming together. And this is how they built the wetlands. So first they laid back the banks. Then they had to use a system that would allow plants to establish themselves in the water, because of course as soon as you lay the banks back, the water inundates. So this system of sort of net fences gave structure to the plants until the plants could take over. You see some of the earthworks, and you can see the inspiration for this particular area. That's the Velodrome. We were really paying attention to sort of the sculptural forms of the venues and the landscape. And again, construction in water. Now, it was interesting because during construction, they thought they would be very crafty, very, very smart, and they used river water to irrigate these trees while they were doing construction. The river water was so polluted it killed the trees. So they had to stop that. But you can see how we were using landforms to create places of gathering. And during construction, it was amazing how fast habitat emerged. It was really amazing how fast wildlife responded. And you can see it coming along. So terraces, we folded terraces into these hillsides for viewing and gathering, and we worked with, they're very big on accessibility for all, and not just accessibility for people with mobility challenges, but accessibility for people with mental challenges, sight challenges of course, but also emotional challenges. So we had to learn about places that make people afraid, places that make people uncomfortable, and design this very, sort of in the end, simple, but during design, complex pedestrian pathway system. No dead ends. So this is all during construction still. And you can see the beginnings of a natural landscape emerging, juxtaposed with these very formed and made landscapes. So that was really a lot of what we were trying to hit, was this right note between a clearly made landscape and a landscape being overtaken by natural systems. In our work, we don't believe in replicating nature. We believe in unleashing systems and letting them take on their own life, but clearly juxtaposing that with a place that is made. And in this case, this landscape has been made and remade multiple times. And then the habitats, the various habitats on the site. This one in particular for frogs. Oh, and that's Handball in the background, which was a temporary structure and is going to Rio. So very quickly, we had a good season in the year the landscape was being installed. It was a very good season, and the landscape really took off and flourished. So this shot, I think, begins to give you a sense of how we use these landforms to create places for people as well as places for plants and habitat. And creating places where you could really escape into the natural environment. Again, a handball in the background. And that was the North Park, so here's the South Park during construction. So you see right away, this is the support for one of the bridges, but you see right away these super graphic hedges that formed part of the structure of the gardens going in right away, early. And then the addition of these custom benches, which are now catalog benches. And again, the sort of graphics of the gardens as well as juxtaposed with the wildness of the gardens. And you can't quite see it, but there are gaps. These are rock, sort of like gabion rock abutments to the bridges. And there are holes in them, and those holes are for specific critters. So everything was habitat. And during construction, the gardens started to emerge in a kind of wildness. And these were the wind energy. In this case, being in Great Britain, it wasn't about solar energy, it was about wind energy. So these are the light standards for the London Games that were about harvesting wind and making wind energy. So in Australia, where it's all about getting out of the sun and having so much sun, in Great Britain it was about wind and capturing every bit of sun you could. So again, you can see this sort of seam here between permanent paving and temporary paving. Okay, so it became it was named the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. Before that, it was just London Olympics, and then it became the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and the games began. And of course, that's the Anish Kapoor piece in the background. And a real emerging district around the games where there had been none before. And so you can see during the games how people use these sort of tilted plains of grass set within this sort of natural landscape to gather and get respite from the huge crowds and also watch what was going on. And it's amazing how mature that landscape got, how fast it got mature. We really had a great year. And this is by the time of the Paralympic Games, so note that's the Paralympic Games. So they had added these barriers for the Paralympic Games. But you can see how it was holding up through those weeks and weeks and weeks. These slopes were starting to get a little bit brown because during the regular games, there were hundreds of thousands of people on them. But you can see, you really see the sort of system between these landforms, these sculpted landforms that allowed all these people to be there and yet feel like they were in nature. And you also see the screens. Really being outside and watching it on the big screens was as much fun or more fun than being inside the venues. Those are those wood terraces, those wood seat walls that you saw earlier. And riparian banks where there had been none before. Happy swans, the obligatory swan shot. Okay, so now we're in the South Garden, the South Park. That was the North Park, that was the environmental park. This is the Festival Park, the South Park, where we were terracing the riverbanks and where it's more urban, you're next to the stadium, and where the themed gardens were. So you see the sort of super graphic hedges moving through the sort of random. So not only does the stadium get smaller post games, but the Aquatic Center got smaller post games as well. So this is the permanent building here. You see that beautiful Zaha Hadid sweep. This was temporary. So it looked like it was made of cardboard. It looked like it was made of plywood or cardboard. And it's for the high diving and for the multiple stands that go up really high. And it's already gone. The mayor of London called the Parklands the winner of the games. So a lot of the design was about negotiating grade change and ramps and steps and accessibility and flow, pedestrian flow. It was one of our biggest challenges. This was the North American Garden. Okay, so post games. The challenges of transformation, how to connect the park to its surroundings, making a park that would be a world-class park. By the way, this is the largest park built in the UK in 150 years, the largest new park built in 150 years. So we were really building upon, Victorian traditions of gardens and parks, but in a way that speaks to our time and our issues. Program, identity, and connections. I mean, really, it became all about how to make this connected to neighborhoods emerging around this site, and being a catalyst for economic and social change, and vitality and robustness in terms of social change. And tricky because the site they chose was an odd site. With a lot of barriers inherent by the river and the train station. And this was really one of the biggest challenges and one of the big surprises that we pulled off. When you think about ecology and program and community, and the fact that they all needed to be perfect, and they all had to come together, like those gardens all had to be in bloom during those 6 weeks in 2012. But then, after 2012, you wanted them to all become a natural system. Each of those systems, more like they would naturally evolve and branch out and become something over time that would evolve and be a more natural kind of situation. The games are very artificial, even though they were the greenest games to date. So we were also looking at not only pedestrian and vehicular and mobility kinds of connections, but also connections in terms of green connections, what we called stitches and fields, destinations and corridors, habitat, of course, flood, of course, all those issues being a part of a landscape. So we really try to think of flood management, habitat creation, circulation systems, all integral and all a part of the landscape, all a part of the public realm. And maximizing development potential, because you need the economic change to happen here. You need private developers to want to be at this address. So basically we're creating an address for private development. And then of course the green corridors and the ecological impact. So there's subtleties here between the games mode plan and the transformation plan, but I hope you can pick up on some of them. Right off the bat, you notice whole areas of paving and venues that turn into green. And you notice whole areas of paving that get much smaller. And then, in here as well. And then some of the habitat and different kinds of landscapes that take the place of the removed venues and paving. And that's it.